Okay, good morning. Time now 8 a.m. In Tokyo, October 26th, Wednesday. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank online morning seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize a series of online seminars to introduce the latest report and analytical works put together by the World Bank, having the authors of those reports presenting the main point to the audience in Japan in a virtual manner. This morning, we are having a pleasure of hosting the team who was in charge of the new report, which is titled The State of Global Learning Poverty 2022 Update. We have two experts connecting from Washington. Let me introduce very briefly each one of them. Firstly, Jose Rogers, who is a lead economist in the global education global practice of the World Bank, who was the co-director of the World Development Report 2018 education. And he actually came to Tokyo to present the WDR after it's been published. Jose, good morning, good evening to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Koichi. Good evening, good morning to you.
Great, thank you very much. And also we have Joan Pedro Azevedo, who is also the lead economist in the education global practice. He actually appeared in one of our morning seminar in 2020. So welcome back to our morning seminar programs. JP, how are you? Good morning, good evening to you.
Good morning, Koichi. It's a pleasure to be here again. And good morning, colleagues in Tokyo.
Great, thank you very much. So next 40 minutes, we are going to listen to both of them presenting the main point of the State of the Global Learning Poverty 2022 update. After their presentation, I'll read the question that we received from you. If you did not have an opportunity to send your question in advance, please do so by sending your question using the online form posted on the announcement page of the seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. I'll read your question after their presentation to asking them to respond to your questions during the Q&A time. With that, I'd like to ask JP and Jose to come in to start your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Koichi. So, well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I will kick us off and then pass it to my colleague, Jose, midway. So it's really a huge pleasure for us to be here sharing the results of this global report, which was produced actually in a very special fashion for us, as it was a joint initiative with actually among six critical players in the education space, right? Beyond the World Bank, we had colleagues from UNICEF, UNESCO, USAID, FCDO, the British aid agency, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. For us, this is of particular importance because it also helps us align messages around this critical topic and really kind of facilitate the communication of a lot of those messages to countries, which is our ultimate objective. So this work is very much kind of an update of an activity that started back in 2019 when the World Bank, together with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, first produced this learning poverty measure. Right, so we would like to start by really kind of refreshing and giving a perspective of what is the construct of this indicator, right, learning poverty, and how we create it and why we create it. So essentially, learning poverty, the concept is really the share of 10-year-olds who cannot read and understand a simple story, right? That is the idea, the notion that we want to capture. Now, we see this measure very much as an early warning indicator for foundations of all subsequent learning and skills that a child needs to acquire throughout their educational life. And it is also an overall indicator of quality of the educational system as a whole. Right. So what you see now on the screen is just a visual representation of a hypothetical country, right, and how we go about creating this measure, right, of learning poverty. And essentially what we're doing here is not only counting or including in this measure the share of kids that at the end of primary or around age 10 are able to read with understanding a simple age appropriate text, but we are also adjusting for the kids that are out of school, right? And this is important because this is from our perspective, every primary school age children or child needs to be in school. So, and of course, once in school, they need to be learning, right? And that's what this multidimensional measure tries precisely to capture, right? So not only the if children are in school, but if once in school, if they are reaching this minimum proficiency level. So in the case of this example here, right, we have a country with about 20% of children out of school, and out of the 80% of kids that are in the educational system, right, about 25% of them are failing to reach this minimum proficiency level, right? So essentially about 60% of all children in the country, not only the children that are in school, but all children in the country are proficient. And the complement of that, 40% are in learning poverty, right? Now, why do we wanted to build this indicator, and why we worked together with UIS or the UNESCO Institute for Statistics to build this? I think that our primary objective with this measure was really to raise awareness to the magnitude of the learning crisis, right? As the WDR of 2018 pointed out, right? We the world faced a tremendous learning crisis, and what this measure tries to do is precisely gives a number, gives a dimension of the magnitude of this crisis, not only globally but across the different regions of the planet, right? So we can draw attention and mobilize action, galvanize action to change this reality on the ground. Um, so so essentially, it was also important for us to build a measure that was easy to communicate and articulate to a broad range of constituents, right? I think one of the messages of this global report, as we'll discuss a bit later, is that to have change on the ground, it is critical to build a coalition among different actors in countries, a national coalition to try to precisely mobilize resources, attention, focus to change the challenges in the education sector. And for that, it is critical to have a way to articulate this message in a simple manner. And that's, I think, one of the values of this measure, because it's relatively simple to give this notion that every primary school age child should be in school, and it's not enough to be in school, they should also be learning and reaching this minimum proficiency level. I think another element that is really important for us is that this measure does not come to compete with the existing international infrastructure on the monitoring of education, of the educational system, right? The learning poverty measure built from the SDG 4 in education, and really uses two of those SDGs to draw attention to this very salient problem, right? And we've worked very closely with UIS in order to build this measure and make sure that there is alignment in order to facilitate also the understanding of this by the countries. So where is the data it's coming from, and how do we calculate? Well, essentially the learning data component of this multidimensional measure is coming from the SDG 4.1.1b, which is the SDG that captures reading at the end of primary. This indicator has both a math and a reading component. We are using the reading component only. And it comes from international assessments such as Pearls, PASEC, TERCE, CEP-LM, to name a few, right? Now, it is important to notice that PISA is not included in this because PISA is measuring learning at a lower secondary, at a later stage, right? So here we're really focusing on those international and national assessments that are capturing the amount of learning that children in school have at the end of primary, which is between ages 10 and 14, depending on the country. And it On the enrollment side, we're using the SDG 4.1.4, which is the one that captures the share of children enrolled in primary education, right? And essentially the definitions of some of these measures, which are in particular the minimum proficiency, the cutoff of this share of children that is able. Gosh, sorry, Alexis talking. Sorry about that. We're cooking here, but so essentially the minimum proficiency level comes from the SDG process, and which has been a very much country-led and consultative process, bringing together countries, agencies, development partners, as well as international experts, right? And that is, I think, a strength of this measure as well, right? Since I think there's been a lot of consultation and country consultation on how many of these aspects of this indicator have been defined, which we were able to build from. But what does the report brings in terms of new numbers, right? And in terms of a global picture. So essentially, as I mentioned, we first started this work back in 2019, and the measure back then had 2015 as a reference year. And at that point, we were able to raise awareness and notice that the world was in a learning crisis, and about 53% of children were not able to read with understanding this age-appropriate text, right? Most of them were actually in school, right? And essentially, as we now receive more data and we're able to build the first global update of this indicator, unfortunately, to some of our surprise, the picture that we got was even more dismal. So now what we've seen as the latest numbers, our latest estimates, is that about 57% of children were below the minimum proficiency level, right? So now some of this comes from regionally comparable numbers, such as the ones that we can see in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, Europe and Central Asia. However, in certain regions, especially East Asia and the Pacific, right, because of the introduction of the new regional assessment, the SEA-PLM, led by CIMIO and UNICEF, right, the numbers were not temporally comparable, right? But we do believe that the estimates that we have for 2019 are of significantly greater accuracy than the ones that we had back in for 2015. But that's not the full picture, right? Between 2019 and now, we've had COVID, right? The world experienced the largest educational shock in recorded history. And essentially, part of what we have been working with these partners has been precisely on simulating and estimating for countries what could be the likely new learning poverty or the likely effect of the school closures that we observed during the pandemic on learning poverty. And our preferred simulation, or base scenario, if you will, suggests that the global learning poverty number would raise to 70%. So this number would go from 57 to 70% in 2022. And Alexa, stop. I don't know how to. Okay, let's see if I can get quiet. But essentially, and we were able to also bring the effect of these learning losses in terms of foregone earnings, right, for this generation of students. And the latest number that we have now is approximately $21 trillion of private earnings lost. This is not the total economic cost, but this is just foregone earning for this generation, this cohort of students, right? Now, one unfortunately, evidence that we have is that the data that is coming from countries like Brazil, India, Mexico, even the US, seem to corroborate these findings, right? In many of these countries, this is the order of magnitude of the increase on the share of children that are failing to reach minimum proficiency standards in many of these countries. Now, and this is what we are seeing here, right? So this is building on work that the Human Development Chief Economist Office is producing. It's going to be a new global report that is expected to come out in January, and I think here's the plug for you guys to invite them as well. I think it's going to be an excellent piece of work, and they're really bringing together a lot of new evidence on the magnitude of the learning losses, and they're going beyond education. They're looking at health, nutrition, and really using the Human Capital Index framework to shed light on this issue. But what we are seeing, right, emerging from many countries is, such as the U.S., is that these school closures have brought countries at levels of learning that were like 10, 15 years ago, right? So the U.S. we're seeing this. In Malawi, for example, the 18 months of learning losses after 7 months of school closures, right? In Bangladesh, 14 and a half months of school closures led to 26 months of learning losses, right? So really learning losses that are more than proportional to the amount of time in which schools were closed, simply because it's not just about the learning that is lost, or the learning that doesn't happen when the kids do not go to school, but there's also the forgetting, right, of previously acquired learning, which is an important element of this. Now, what it's kind of one stylized fact that is coming out of this work is really that, on average, there's about a one-to-one relationship between these learning losses and the length of the school closures, right? Which is just a kind of an initial stylized fact that is emerging from this literature, right? That is being essentially systematized by this upcoming global report that our chief economist is producing. And what is also important is that there are lots of learning inequalities, right? That this is not happening in the same way across all different groups in countries, or even within the distribution of learning. So what we are seeing in Mexico, for example, in the state of Guanajuato, is essentially that those losses seem to be larger among girls and kids that are on earlier grades, right? In the case of Bangladesh, those losses seem to be much larger among children from families with much lower levels of human capital of the mothers, right? So mothers with less education, children coming from those families were losing almost 3 times more in math than kids that parents or mothers had tertiary education, right? So this is a very unequal crisis. This is a crisis that unfortunately all the data that is coming from the countries at this stage seems to support that the learning losses are real, and if anything, actually to some extent underestimated. So now I'll transfer to Halsey.
Great, thank you, JP. So João Pedro has just talked about how we're seeing these very large learning losses, both in the simulations at the global level, and then increasingly also from actual data that we're getting from country after country. There was more news in the newspaper today here about the very large losses in the United States, for example. But we're seeing this in many countries. And this is, of course, quite disappointing that we see that the actual learning losses are really validating the assumptions we made in those simulations to come up with the global numbers. But it's much more than just learning losses. So as JP emphasized, learning poverty is really an easy to understand indicator of the extent of the learning crisis and the crisis in schooling more generally. But of course, we see many other crises in education and in human development. We see cost in many different dimensions. There are obviously these very large losses beyond learning, Some of these will be covered in the global report that's forthcoming that João Pedro talked about. So extensive losses that we see, for example, in increases in child stunting and wasting. You see the numbers there. Again, these are projections, so we'll have to see how the data come in, but clearly they're very worrisome. And the closure of schools probably contributed to this by removing access to school meals programs for children, for example. We also see higher rates of female dropout and pregnancy in some countries. I don't want to make it seem like this is a general pattern across countries, but it was clearly a worry before the pandemic started. I mean, as the pandemic started, and we're seeing it at least in some cases, as in these Kenya findings. We, of course, there are socio-emotional costs to the pandemic, again, and likely partly triggered by the school closures and the lack of social contact, so increased depression and anxiety, including as children now return to school. So we have to keep in mind those costs. We also see, for example, very large youth employment losses. So it's not just a problem of learning and basic education and in occasional cases of schooling and access, but we also see a loss of both youth employment and youth wages that is not made up for by, for example, increased enrollment of youth in secondary or higher education. All of this adds up to a lot of losses. JP mentioned the $21 trillion figure for future earning losses. Of that share, 11 trillion comes from this generation of primary and secondary school students in the low and middle income countries. That's a huge cost to those economies. It translates into about a 10% drop in projected lifetime earnings for students in those countries if we don't make up those losses and help students to recover learning. So what do we need? We need real political commitment for the huge task of recovery and then building forward better. And we don't have to suffer those costs. I mean, let me just remind all of us that we, the global community, all the countries in the world, made a commitment under SDG 4 to quality basic education for all, actually to quality primary and secondary education for all. And so what that means is that we should be getting to zero learning poverty by 2030. But this graph shows, as João Pedro already did, that we had an increase between 2015 and 2019. We've had this further increase to an estimated 70% in 2022. So obviously, it's going to be extremely challenging to reduce learning poverty sharply, whether to the zero that's envisioned by the Sustainable Development Goals, or even to the figure of around a little under 40%, around 40% that comes out of the UNESCO global monitoring process for the SDGs, where countries have submitted their own national targets. If you add those up, at least those that have come in so far, we see that countries themselves are aiming at least to reduce by nearly a half from our expected, what we now think the level is of 70% learning poverty. They want to get it down to around 40% or a little less by 2030, even though that's falls short of the 0% we envisioned or are committed to under the SDGs. It's still extremely ambitious. So what that means is, in order to achieve that, we're going to have very strong political commitment. That means political commitment, not just from the top leadership, although that's essential to help set the direction, but really wider social mobilization. This is an effort that takes all of us. It takes parents, it takes teachers, it takes education policymakers, it takes support from the business community, for example. It takes support from NGOs to raise the alarm and to mobilize. So how will we know when we have some sustained political commitment in a country? We will see things like regular measurement of learning. As I'll discuss in a couple of minutes, many countries just don't have good measures of learning yet. So we don't know where the gaps are. We don't know how to target the action. We need clear targets, because otherwise this all stays in the realm of kind of lofty goals of making sure that all children read. But if we don't have targets that will indicate whether or not we're making sufficient progress, it's not likely to happen. And then we need evidence-based national plans and sufficient financing for those in order to really make this push for learning recovery. And we we can form global coalitions, and that's what we've tried to do by working together with UNICEF, UNESCO, FCDO, USAID, the Gates Foundation, all in this effort to try to support countries that show strong political commitment to learning recovery. Now, what would that look like? This is a graph from a report we came out with in December, also with UNICEF and UNESCO, that points out that you see the black line there is the learning trajectory pre-COVID. Before COVID, that was already much too shallow a slope of improvement. We should have seen something much more rapid. Where we are now, we're afraid, is down at that yellow line toward the bottom. So we've seen a drop off in actual learning, those learning losses that João Pedro talked about. And the real fear is that now we're going to see children learning even more slowly, because when they return to the classroom really isn't ready to deal with these children who, for example, they in some countries, schools were closed for about 2 years. So you took second graders, you closed schools, tried to teach to them remotely, but in fact, the remote education, remote learning, we know from a lot of evidence, was often not very effective. Then 2 years later, you reopen schools, you put them in fourth grade, and you expect them to learn at a fourth grade level, when many of them weren't even at a second grade level when the school is closed, and now they're still at a second grade level or below. It's unlikely to work very well. Students are likely to have a great deal of trouble learning. They won't be able to follow the curriculum. They won't be able to follow what their teachers are trying to teach them. So it's absolutely crucial to, as I'll discuss in a minute, to make sure that we're adjusting to the level of the children and using the most effective techniques we have for rapid learning, for acceleration of learning, so that we can get on this blue line, this blue trajectory of a much more rapid pace of learning improvement than we had before COVID, so that we can not only get back up to that black line, have complete learning recovery, but go beyond it. And so that's the goal that we're all committing to. How do we do that? What does that look like? Well, we've launched together with our partners this RAPID framework, which is essentially a menu learning recovery program based on evidence of the best strategies for recovering learning and more generally accelerating learning. And this is based on a lot of evidence from before the pandemic, from the highest quality evidence. We see some countries already putting these in place, but we think it's really crucial for many more countries to adopt many more of these elements that you have in these pillars. Now, what does RAPID stand for? What does RAPID stand for? So R is for reach every child and keep them in school. So the first thing we have to do is make sure all children are in school. Most countries have by now reopened schools, but they need to make sure that all children are returning to the classroom. They need to adopt special incentives to get children who are more marginal in terms of their attachment to schooling to make sure that they're in schools. And these are often children from poor families or families with less education. And at the same time, they need systems that can identify the at-risk students, those who are most at risk of dropping out, for the reasons I just gave, that unless classrooms are well adapted to the students' needs, we could face an increased risk of dropout for many students. So that's first, but just getting them in school is not enough. And that's an important message we're trying to get across to governments, that they really have to change the way they're doing business. Business as usual from before the pandemic won't work. So we need to assess learning levels regularly. The first step is really to understand where students are, how much learning they've lost, so that then we'll be able to adjust. And you need to give teachers tools so that they can do this within the classroom as well as having good system level assessments so that policymakers can understand what's happening with learning. Third, the P, we need to prioritize teaching the fundamentals. Many education systems in low and middle income countries have what are really overstuffed curriculums. They're trying to teach too many things to children who haven't mastered the basics. And so we're encouraging countries to really focus, and there's a lot of evidence for this as well, the value of focusing in on the foundational skills that children need, the foundational literacy, foundational numeracy, basic social emotional skills, so that they can master those and then use those as a springboard for acquiring all the other skills that we all want them to achieve. And so it's important to really make sure that the curriculum focuses on that. Fourth, increase the efficiency of instruction, including through catch-up learning. So that's the I. So there we want to use the most effective and the most cost-effective approaches. And those are things like targeted instruction, which has been called teaching at the right level. And there are various techniques for that, for making sure that each child is able to learn from their own starting point. The structured pedagogy, which gives teachers more tools that they can use, for example, teacher guide that really help them, particularly when teachers don't have the very strong training, strong educational background, it helps support them. Or tutoring, there are many other approaches, and those are really detailed in the RAPID framework. And crucial to that is that we have to support teachers throughout and give them practical pedagogical skills so that they know how to deal with these very challenging classrooms. And then use technology, make sure it's in the service of these approaches, rather than letting technology drive our strategy. And then finally, develop psychosocial health and well-being. Given the social emotional costs, the anxiety, depression, et cetera, it's very important to help teachers support their students, support those who most need it. So that's the RAPID framework. Sorry, let me make one other point. Sorry, this is not advancing. Here we go. So that's the strategy. To support that strategy, we need much better data. There are very large data gaps, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa, so that really leave policymakers flying blind in many countries. So we find that for more than half of the school-age population in sub-Saharan Africa, we don't have the data we need in order to calculate these learning poverty indicators. And so instead, we have to, when we're coming up with these estimates, we have to use the averages from other countries in the region. And that is clearly a huge problem because policymakers won't know what to target. They won't have the data they need in order to find the size of the gaps, who needs the most support, and whether or not their strategies are working. And this is also true in Middle East and North Africa, and to a lesser extent in other regions. And so we have a spotlight in this report that calls for a deep dive on data and measurement for fighting learning poverty. So we need both system level data on learning. So that can be essentially random samples of classrooms in order to give a sense of what the average child is acquiring in terms of skills, and also where the gaps are by different demographic indicators of different regions of the country. But also classroom level data that teachers can work with in order to guide their own instruction. For this reason, we and our partners have launched a Learning Data Compact, which is aiming to help countries make sure that every country has what are called temporally comparable learning measures that we can compare across time for at least 2 grades, 2 subjects, and 2 years by 2027. And I mean, this seems like the absolute minimum, but this is a very big task, and we really have to focus together as a global community to support that, or we will find that we get to 2030 and we still don't have indicators for too many countries. When we have these indicators and we have this data and we can calculate the learning poverty indicator, we believe that it can really help align the multiple objectives of the education system, making sure that all children at a minimum have access to basic education and high quality learning as a foundation for everything else that we want to achieve and that countries want to achieve in education systems. So I want to thank you for your attention and look forward to discussion with you. Here are three of the recent reports that we've come out with that a lot of these details come from, and you're welcome to click on those and you'll be able to find all the details. But now I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, JP and Hansei, for your presentation, giving us a snapshot and main point of the report, State of the Global Learning Poverty 2022 update. We received several questions from the viewers in advance, so let me read those questions asking you to respond. Of course, these are questions came in advance to the presentation, so you sort of touch upon the some of the elements that the viewers was asking, but I'll read the question asking you to respond anyway. First question is this. When the world entered the pandemic, distance learning and other technologies would expectedly offer solutions for students to continue learning and training. How would the report see this element, and what can we do about it to further take advantage of technologies? Question related to technologies, I'll say, JP, if you have any comment, please.
Oh, sure. No, thank you very much, Koichi, and thank you for that question. So distance learning, certainly every country, virtually every country, after the pandemic hit and they were forced to close schools, made some kind of effort to set up a remote learning system so that children could keep a connection with the school system. So ideally, they could keep learning. Now, as you can imagine, this is extremely challenging in many countries. Countries such as I'm sure Japan and some OECD countries were able to shift relatively effectively to online learning, although that was a huge challenge in many other OECD countries. But that simply was not an option for most low and middle income countries, with a small number of exceptions, such as Uruguay, for example, which had already set up an effective online learning system that connected all students to teachers and to the school system. Most countries didn't have that. And so, of course, governments tried what are called multimodal strategies. They tried different ways of reaching these students. So not just through online learning, but through TV broadcasts of lessons, through radio broadcasts of lessons, in some cases through distribution of printed material, in some innovative cases through, for example, WhatsApp messages to parents with very short lessons that the parents could pass on to the children. So they tried many things, but frankly, most systems just weren't ready for it. And so no matter how much they scrambled, it was very difficult even to make sure that they were connecting at all with all children. So many children were left out, and these typically were children from families with the lowest education, the lowest income, perhaps the most rural families, as we would expect. And we see this in the data on learning losses. But even where there was some kind of connection, typically we learned very clearly that remote learning is not a good substitute for in-person learning. Children need teachers, they need that contact with their peers because there's a social emotional component to learning. They need the encouragement of teachers. Teachers need the contact in order to be able to understand where their children are struggling. And that's very hard to do over any of these modes, including even online, and especially the others, which typically are not as interactive. So what that means is that, as João Pedro showed, that on average across all countries, for every month the schools were closed, we saw children losing a month of learning. And that's not what we would expect if remote learning was effective. So that's really a tragic lesson, probably something we could have guessed, that clearly it's better for children to be in school, but it's really, the data has really driven that home. And so that's why we emphasize it's so important whenever possible to keep schools open or to reopen them as soon as possible when you have circumstances like this hit. As soon as you can do so safely, it's very important to get children back into school. João Pedro, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, maybe just to point out, and we can share the links. I think we produced a couple of interesting reports back in November last year, touching precisely on the issue of remote learning. One was a more qualitative work, looking at actual experiences from several countries, and another one which was a more quantitative in terms of the big lessons, which are very much aligned to what Halsey has been saying. But if anybody's interested in the actual country examples, right? I think that the big question for us, I think, and I think the question touches upon that, is what are the lessons going forward, right? I think one of the concerns is it could be a big waste, right? I mean, we know it hasn't worked. We know so it would have been surprising, actually, if we think about it, if it had worked, right? Because these things were rolled out under the worst possible circumstances, right? So if it had worked, you know, I mean, it would have been tremendous, but very surprising, I would say. So, but the problem is that hopefully this will not create a sense that technology cannot play a role, right? And of course, technology can never replace the teachers. It can never replace the relationship, right? Which is critical for the learning experience. But we see it playing a role in many parts of the world, right? And we need to continue to explore and make it better, right? And not lose sight of what matters, right? And that is no magic bullet, right? And it takes time, it takes resources, it takes planning. It's not the kind of thing that you can just wing it, very quickly and roll it out at scale, right? It takes planning and intention.
Thank you for your responses. Second question, what does the report say about more vulnerable children, such as those with disabilities? Any comment, please?
So maybe I can jump in. I think by and large, one element that we try to highlight in the short presentation in here, but we have it in the report, is that the kids that were already more vulnerable pre-pandemic were the ones that unfortunately suffered the most, right? So this is seen from the point of view of age of the child. This is seen from the point of view of the socioeconomic background of those children, right? So those that were already vulnerable, right? We were all under the same storm. Nobody had umbrellas of the same size, right? And many of us didn't even have umbrellas. So it has been a very unequal crisis, and it has been a crisis that has affected the most vulnerable disproportionately more. So that is I think something that is coming out very clearly. Now, I think that there is an element of that, which I think the question touches upon, which is there is a problem of lack of data, and there are certain groups that are still and remaining visible, right? The disabled is one of those, right? I think we still have tremendous data gaps around the issue of disability. I think that the global community, the international community, has made significant progress in agreeing on a common definition of disabilities following the Washington Group process and consensus, which the World Bank was part of, UNICEF was part of, WHO. So there's been a new realignment among researchers and development partners and countries in terms of how to define disability in the space of surveys and in the space of data collection efforts, not the medical, right, but in terms of population statistics. However, this is a relatively recent initiative, right? And it hasn't yet materialized on the data collection efforts that we have been able to use so far. So I think this is definitely work to be done, and it's an area in which we will need, I think, again, a lot of intention and coordination.
And I just add on that point, which is the World Bank is committed to make all of its education programs and projects disability inclusive by 2025. And so one element of that is making sure that we have data coming out of our projects so that we can help to fill this data gap. But obviously we need to work with all of our partners and with governments on this because it is a very, very big gap, as JP is saying.
Thank you for your responses. Let me read the third question. Let me screen here. Yes. How do the co-author donor organizations work together to push this agenda? And how do you see the responses and reactions from other partners, including other developed countries and developing countries themselves? We heard that you talked about the rapid framework, but if you can elaborate a little bit more on practical sort of plans, including maybe timelines about how to push this agenda together with other partners. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Let me just start by emphasizing what João Pedro already talked about, which is this really unprecedented collaboration with these 5 other organizations. And we've, throughout the pandemic, have been working with UNESCO and UNICEF to try to make sure that we have a common message, that we're singing from a common songbook, as they say, to make sure, because we understand just how hard it is to get attention to education when there are so many other crises going on at once: the food and energy crisis, the security crises around the world, the climate crisis. These are all extremely important, but we want to make sure that the education, that the cost to this generation of children and youth don't get lost in all the attention to all the other crises. And so that's why we've worked with UNESCO and UNICEF from the beginning of the pandemic to really track the extent of the crisis and to promote measures to really recover from it. And we were very happy to be able to expand this coalition to include the UK and US aid agencies and the Gates Foundation. We've also worked with some other organizations and countries to make a commitment to action, to agree that we will work together to try to, at a minimum, cut learning poverty in half by 2030 by using approaches like those that we've talked about here. And so we think this is very important. We've put a lot of effort into this, and so have our partners. And we definitely hope that that as many other governments as possible will join us. And we think it's very important to be working with the government of Japan and many others on this agenda. In terms of what's the agenda going forward, we are very much implementing the rapid framework through our projects, and we see a lot of efforts with our colleagues working in particular countries with the governments to integrate that rapid framework, key elements of it, into the learning recovery projects that governments are now launching. And we know that our colleagues are doing the same, our partner institutions. But really, this has to come primarily from governments. We are there to advise and support them, but it really comes from governments, from societies. And that's why I emphasized a few minutes ago the need for society-wide political commitment to recovery and acceleration so that we don't lose this generation of children and youth.
Thank you very much for your responses. Appreciate it. We received a question from Mariko-san, posted on the YouTube chat section, and I have forwarded cut and paste version of those questions to both of you, Jose and Pedro. So you can just, I'm giving you a time for you to think about the responses. But let me read the question that we received from Mariko-san. Thank you for your presentation. 2 comments, questions. First, you said that teachers and children should concentrate on prioritized subject or content. In reality, in some countries, I have observed perhaps various ways in how they implemented project in schools. So that's the first point. And the second point, do you have any discussions of measures to mitigate unexpected negative effect of far too many learning assessment? PISA provides a good example. In many governments started teaching to the test. So these are the 2 points raised by Mariko-san, Mariko Shiohata-san. Thank you very much for your point. I would like to ask Jose and JP to come into response. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So I think this is an important question, right? When it's too many learning assessments. And I think we need to take a step back and kind of remind ourselves of the figure that and the point that Halsey made, right? That in 45 or 55% of children in the sub-Saharan African continent, they don't have a measure of learning that is temporally comparable to, and or even comparable to anything, right? In the last 15 years, and in many of them, they never had, right? So there is an OECD debate, right? Maybe a high income country debate about the, when it's too many assessments, right? And you have the PISA and you have the PEARLs and you have the TIMSS, right? And you have the national learning assessments. And it is important to make a distinction between assessments and exams, right? Because the large scale assessments, these are not high stake assessments, right? These are not trying to measure the learning of and create a grade and a score for an individual pupil, right? Those are statistical exercises that are trying to have a system level measure of the quality of the educational system, right? Which is very different from a high stake exam, right? And those, what we see happening is that, the PISA, for example, program happens every 3 years, right? When you look at the primary school age assessments, the international and regionals, most of them are happening the regional ones happening every 7 years, every 6 years. So much more far in between, right? When you look at countries that have really made some dent and some progress in learning, countries like Brazil, they are measuring learning with a large scale national learning assessment every 2 years, right? Of course, you're not measuring every grade and you're not measuring every subject. You're being selective in those, right? But you need to measure with a certain frequency and a certain predictability, right? In order to have agents in the system believing that this information will be useful to adjust course and change behavior, right? I think that is also another element of this, right? If we believe that knowing your number, knowing where you are is a critical element to help your system to change behavior and action in the classroom, right? This needs to happen at a certain frequency, right? And our attention right now, it's less on the PISA and lower secondary, but really a focus on early grade and end of primary, right? Because there, the distance between the rich countries and the developing world is absurd, right? It's already bad in lower secondary, but in primary, it's a tenfold, eightfold difference between a high income country and let's say sub-Saharan Africa. It's ninefold, right? While high income countries have a learning poverty of 8%, right? Sub-Saharan Africa have a learning poverty pre-pandemic of 90%, of 86%, right? That is the magnitude of the gap, right? So I think measurement is still needed, especially in early grade and end of primary, especially in low and middle income countries.
Yeah, I think it's very important to underline what JP is saying, that we really have a very different situation in many low and middle income countries from the OECD countries. I also want to emphasize when João Pedro is talking about the need for more measurement in many countries, we're not talking about high stakes exams that select children into and out of future paths. So we're not talking about university entrance exams, high school entrance exams for all children. We're talking about primarily a couple of different types of assessment. One is measuring student learning in a sample of schools and classrooms so that policymakers and other stakeholders can get a sense of what's going on system-wide. And of course, this doesn't have any stakes attached to it because it's just a random sample of students who take the test. They don't know why. It's simply to get a sense of what's going on in the system. So that is not a risk to children, to students. A second type is classroom assessment. So in order for teachers to help their children, they have to know whether they're learning or not, what the teacher is teaching them. And we find in many systems, often because you have large classrooms, you have teachers who aren't trained in assessment, they don't really have any effective way to gauge what students are learning and what they aren't, and therefore they can't help them. Again, this is not high stakes testing. This is just the kind of checking for understanding that teachers need to be doing in order to be effective. That's what we're calling for, just to be very clear. It's not high stakes testing that will affect children. Then the other question that Mariko-san asked about was whether it's important to concentrate on prioritized subjects or contents. And we think this is very important for most countries. In most countries, we find that teachers are trying to cover far too much. And what that means is because it's rushed, because teachers don't have mastery of how to teach particular subjects or topics within subjects, children end up learning very little or almost nothing. And we see this. We have evidence from classrooms, for example, in India, showing where you have these very nice graphs showing that the curriculum is proceeding like this, but then you look at the distribution of skills of the students in that classroom. And typically the top students are sort of below where the curriculum should be. And many of the others are 2 grades behind, 3 grades behind. And that's simply because teachers are having to try to do too much. They're being forced to do too much for the curriculum, and so they can't make sure that children have the foundations that they need in order to have building blocks to then learn everything else that we want them to learn that's in the curriculum. So we have to do that in a sequence that can allow all children to participate so we don't leave children behind. And if with the current overstuffed curricula, the only children who benefit from that are those who have very strong support at home or are very educated parents who have resources maybe for outside tutoring. Everybody else is left behind, and that's what we want to avoid. And that, let me just say, that's the lesson from the systems that have been most successful. We have in João Pedro's home country of Brazil, we have the municipality of Sobral, the state of Ceará, that have made tremendous progress in making sure that all children learn to read by 2nd or 3rd grade, despite being some of the poorer systems and regions in Brazil. And they've done that in part through making sure that all children are being able to read, making that the focus before trying to do other things, and then supporting teachers in the most effective way of teaching that, guided by the type of classroom assessments that allow them to help all students. And that's why we think that's so important.
Thank you very much. We have 2 minutes left in our seminar time, so I would like to ask JP and Halsey to give us a very final remarks or any messages to the viewers, and then we wrap up our seminar. JP, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you once again for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure to be here again sharing this work. I think the message I believe is it is possible. It is possible to revert that, right? These simulations, these projections do not need to happen. We believe that countries can recover and accelerate learning. It will take intention, it will take work, it will take effort and resources. And I think the rich countries do have to play a role helping the less well-off countries in the planet, both in terms of showing and suggesting policies, ideas, but also providing resources. But it is possible to revert this.
I think that's exactly right. But we do need your help. We need to all do this together because otherwise this remains a largely hidden crisis. Many governments will think that as long as the children are back in school, then they can just go back to business as usual. They've got other problems to deal with, and they may not focus enough attention on the children and youth and making sure that we have learning recovery. So we can do it if we work together, but we have to really focus on it, and we have to do this quickly before children fall further behind. So we thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss this challenge with you and also to discuss how we can move ahead.
Thank you very much. In fact, Mariko-san continued posting her responses. Let me read before the wrapping up a seminar. Even in low-income countries, district and schools' reputations can depend on assessment results, not exam results. This can affect classroom pedagogy. High stake can have different meanings. So Mariko-san, if you can send me an email. To my email address, which is appearing on the announcement page of the seminar, we can sort of continue a discussion with Halsey and JP. With that, I'd like to once again thank you, the JP and Halsey, for your time being with us. we look forward to having you in the future again for other reports or other occasions. Of course, in person coming to Tokyo would be most welcome. We are more than happy to organize the opportunity for discussion with the Japanese stakeholders. Thank you very much.
We would love that. Arigato gozaimasu. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Obrigado.
Thank you very much. Okay, so next week we continue organizing the other morning seminars. In fact, we are going to have John Buffett and Peter Nagel, who actually are the commodity the market and commodity price data guru of the World Bank, visiting Tokyo, in fact. And we are going to have the seminar on commodity market outlook, which actually is going to be released tomorrow in Washington time. And then this seminar is going to be held at 12 p.m. To 1 p.m. on the November 1st in Tokyo. You are welcome also to join the seminar in a face-to-face manner, but we also are going to live stream the seminar for you to join virtually. And also we are going to have the another morning seminar on Friday next week featuring the Europe and Central Asia economic update. This is going to be at 8 a.m. In the morning on Friday next week. With that, once again, thank you very much for watching. Stay safe, stay healthy. See you next week. Thank you very much.